Hello, this is the Harboring Light. I'm Mary. I give a conservative perspective about the world around me. Feedback is immensely important. Feel free to reach out. 2 ways to do this is email and YouTube. And as I mentioned, I am currently running ads 2 ways. So you can see me on TVs, visually see an ad about the Harboring Light on the on the Paramount Plus streaming apps here and the affiliated. I think the biggest one that's affiliated with what I understand with Paramount Plus is Pluto. So you hear an ad, you see an ad, and hear it too. But you see an ad that's talking about the Harboring Light. That is my podcast. All right, and also auditorily, you can hear it with a visual aid about promoting my podcast through different podcasts and also music streaming devices that offer and have podcasts on it, like like Pandora, Spotify, so forth. All right, so it's Friday, so I am focusing in on all of you. So this means that I'm going to continue out talking about Dutch literature, but this time I'm going to focus on Dutch literature from the 20th century. Here we go. Okay, so as I said on last week, I was touching on it a little bit. So I'm going to get into more depth about my thoughts and my aspects on Dutch literature that's centered around the 20th century here. And so this is what I'm going to start out talking about. I'm starting out talking about World War II. And then I'm going to get into the specifics of what is written about in the source that I have. And this time I'm going to read from the Britannica. Okay, so, wow. World War II. Means there was a lot of different perspectives going on from that war, right? So, the main perspective is, which is really prevalent in this case to Dutch literature is the aspects of Adolf Hitler and his invasion, and the aspects of how socialism and having the imperialist ideology that, we must make our breed is better than the other and damn to anything else, right? That's what really needs to be understood right here about the aspects of seeing, overcoming, and moving forward. And see, that's what gets lost in a lot in the landscape of culture today. Yes, that's, of this horrific event did unfortunately happen. But we must also understand it for what it was and what it is. That if you have a radicalized ideology, which is socialism, and you make excuses for it and make it seem, not all socialism is bad. So, for instance, we have Social Security for the elderly people and, things of that nature. That's needed. Stuff like that is needed. But when we have fanatical, radical ideas mixed in it and having upfront prejudice of others and having that rudimental aspects into the value and the culture of socialism, that's when it goes havoc. And that's what is falling on deaf ear to, all these young, militant people wanting to find a problem where there really isn't a problem. And I don't know, it's one of those things which is the unfortunate side of evolvement and true progression in society. So when there's not a whole lot of reason for people to be in this perpetual state of survival mode, and they have, time to have leisure time or so forth, unfortunate things like this happen, and all these radical ideologies happen to where, people lose touch on the pulse of reality here, okay? So how is this important into the context in which I'm going to cover now? It's important, I think. Now, this is my humble opinion, because it sets up the understanding and the psychology of how people viewed what they were dealing with in the situation that was going on at that time. And it's also a good lesson to learn about the aspects of how, when you're faced with so much immense adversity, just because, some idiot walking around saying, hey, you know what? I think we should have a powwow here, so to speak, here with this, saying, we can include all of this about just gathering here. And I think we should have this strict societal issue to annihilate and wipe out, which means we're talking about not only with Jewish culture and Jewish people, it goes on down the line with, Eastern European and so forth. And also, it's a lot to be said when the whole idea of hurt people, hurt others, and so forth. So what am I saying about this? So if I'm understanding this correctly, if I'm, getting all this right, there was a time where Adolf Hitler, and he was in the midst of wanting to be an art student or something like that. And if I'm not mistaken, he was rejected, and a lot of this internalized into his brain about, how he wanted to form and rechange the concept of how things are, perceived naturally, or what they meant naturally. So what do I mean by this? So the SS, right? And the aspects of the swastika and the Nazi symbol. Initially, before he became and took total control and power, the swastika was not a bad symbol. It meant peace and harmony. And the Reich and the SS, all those, they were symbolic for something, to mean something else that was of a good quality. And so he understood the aspect and the notion that image is everything. And that's something to think about when we go in and transition in the aspects of then and now. When we get all this mixed up about in the cultural landscape of the day. Oh, you're a Nazi because you don't agree with me, or you are a Nazi. You see, these things, it strips away from what people actually went through, and the immense suffering that people actually went through. But the key and the idea here is they overcome, and they were able to build up and, move on and move forward in all these things. And then also this thing too, where you see things for what it is. There was, on the other hand, people who were in Germany and all these other places who risked their lives to save others. It wasn't all this, one-sided thing, right? And so that's what needs to be understood when transitioning into this, when we get into the aspects of literature, okay? Literature is a powerhouse to have, not only from a fictional point of view, but the real accounts or historical accounts, or the tip of the tongue phenomenon here, when scribers and so forth, all this documenting actual accounts, that's why it's so important to preserve things like this, because this really helps other generations to understand what has already happened and to make decisions, either both good or bad, but to make decisions properly if you understand and respect the aspects of how important it is to know that. So with that said here, I am going to get into talking about Dutch literature in the 20th century here. So of course, as I always mention, this source will be provided for you. So the writers of the Dutch revival of the 1880s were essentially individualistic. But in the next generation, a new concern for philosophical and social problems became very apparent. So the poetry of prominent socialist writer named, now I'm going to do my best to pronounce here, Henriette Roland Holtz van der Schoesluck, was characterized by the desire for justice and charity. So the socialist dramas of Heremans were internationally successful. A group of naturalists, realists, and novelists, including Franz Cohen and most gifted of all, Marcel Immense, also flourished. So Arthur van Schurstel made his debut with the Nomadic fiction, and Louis Marie and Corpus was at his peak and a style of chronicling the life of Haig. Alright, so let's go on. Significant early poets were A. Roland Horst and J.C. Bloom and P.N. Van Eyck. A philosophical poet and essayist. Immediately after World War I, two poets emerged was Hendrik Marshman, an advocate for free verse and a representative of the vinylist movement, and the pessimistic Jan Jacob Slaughterhoff, whose works reflect the restless romantic and disillusionment that characterized his life. And so this is this is all setting up the landscape of how, when we get into the 20th century with transitioning into how the psyche and the social cultural landscape started to evolve and change. So it was a time, as mentioned here, where people, the best way to talk about this from a European point of view is the books like from Jane Austen. She's more American writer. I'm thinking back in my mind more of that, but the Bronte sisters and all this, with the aspects of Jane Eyre and so forth and things like that. When you get this whirlwind, romantic, but sort of a little bit realistic and feminist aspects about the disposition and cultural class and the differences between male and female, and romantic ideas about love and relationships. When it transitions to the aspects of being very pessimistic against this and having natural, brutal, internalized perspective to flip on this, to say, well, this kind of dog eat dog, nothing ever gets better, and all these things are turning itself and changing the ideas of the way literature can be written. Alright, so, and then a lot of stuff, when people go see and actually account and be in the midst of war, that really changes dispositions too. Alright, so the literary periodical form was founded in 1932 by the Mentor Tabrock and Edward D. Perron, leaders of a movement that aimed to replace superficial elegance with greater sincerity, and warned against the German threat before the war. You see what I'm saying? Like propaganda. Here, hey man, look, seeing through the BS. Trying to tell people, hey, don't fall for this crap. See, that's why I'm telling you. It's very important to see things for what it is, and then have yourself in your mind wanting to know more about the aspects of what is accounted for of when we think about history here. So the most important mid-20th century Dutch writer, Simon Westdijk, was originally associated with the Forum group, while Ferdinand Bodenwijk style was the aspects of haunted, fanciful original fiction. So the most original poet was Geert Archberg, whose poems explored the boundary between life and death. Now, during the Nazi occupation, free literature either stopped or was published secretly. So the poets known as men of the 50s rejected the reflective lyricalism of the internal war years in favor of the experimental style that drew on Dada, Surrealism, and primitive and the aspects of children's art to create a maximum of physicality. So, quite interesting how that works when when we go into the artwork, or let me say that the art world, right? Poets, right? How that goes hand in hand with literature and art, physical art, and finding an escape to express oneself and to talk about the realities of the situation in which they were living in. Here we go to resurface this through art with these movements here, with this Dada movements, the surrealism, and so forth. And it's very interesting because and all these other artists, that found suit with this, and I don't know, it's one of those complicated things because some, like it's saying, for instance, they were moving away because they were being so restricted with the aspects of the Nazi invasion and so forth. So they wanted to find freedom and understanding through going back to having a primitive childlike imagery and the way creating art. But at the same time, some people say that, and neurologists, there's been studies about this where they say, I'm thinking about, oh God, not, it's just, let me look at, because I don't know, I know what I'm talking, I know his name, but, hold on just a minute. Let me look him up. You know how you know, but you just slips right out of your mind. Let me see. Picasso. All right, so it's alleged that Picasso, when he later on in his paintings, when he was getting up there in years, that he was actually suffering from a brain issue. And there's been other accounts for other artists that they have some neurological issue to where which is, one of those things to, have a second look at it too, which is, it understands or explains why they're so gifted as artists, so forth. But at the same time here, when what I just read, it's really something about the aspects of how Adolf Hitler and the Nazi invasion, how that just totally changed the cultural landscape of everything in the world. And it just reshaped so much, and art in the art form, took notice of that, and people just used it as an escape to really bring light to all these things. All right, so let's get back to it. It says minimal punctuation, neorism, and startling associative imagery were used in poetry. Lubric, the pseudonym, which was a pseudonym of Lubertus Jacobs Swan Wick. So the poets of the following decade, among them was J. Berliff, a pseudonym of Hendrik Jan Marsman. It was reaction as let me say this again, which reacted with a deliberately low-key style, prosy style. So Hans Cornels and Ten Berg richly was elusive poems. So the poet's ego is submerged into a closely structured exploration of language, myth, and history. So when the 70s came along, Gert Kermink and others returned to traditional forms such as the sonnet and the rhyme, often with knowing and ironic undertones. So post-war novelists showed that the influence of the Nazi occupation was showcasing in various ways. So one example here is Anna Blaman treated existential solitude, while Woman of Friedrich Henrin's classically constructed stories and novels, notably in 1958 when this was released, The Dark Room of the Damcoles, and the Norman Shapen in 1966, No More Sleep, which is what that means, was compelling and presented a hostile universe that is chaotic and unfavorable. Alright, so war for Hermans is simply an intensification of the abic human condition. So Gerald Colness and Van Hit Rev, who made his debut as a deadpan chronicle of post-war in the Malaise of the Avon of 1947, or The Evenings, and also wrote in such books as The Natter Tout Ute in 1966, Near to Thee. So extravagant which blended the extravagant and the virtuoso, and blended the fact and the fiction in the name of the romantic decadence. Alright, so moving on here. Now, okay, so let's see. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna go on by saying this. So, Harry Muskis from the Hetstein Broodbed in 1959, and the Stone Bottle Bed, set a post-war dressing to a later treatment of the aftermath of the occupation. So, which was released in 1982, which was entitled The Attack. Though he belongs chronically to the war generation, Jan Wolkers began writing in the 60s and brought a visual artistic sensibility to his often brutal stories and novels. So reactions to the painful loss of the empire in the East Indies ran a gauntlet of nostalgia to affect bitterness, and also along with the bitterness, the alienation in the work of Bed Volk, by name of Elizabeth Volk. So Maria Dermont and Alberts and the colonial experience continues to be a source of inspiration. So the tradition of Sombre and the anecdotal realism dating from the late 19th century was continued with great popular success by Martin T. Hart de Annerspiersk. In 1979, Bearers of Bad Tidings was drew fruitfully on the experience of a strict Calvinist upbringing. And also, that's one of those things, is unfortunate. It can happen. Well, good or bad, religion is another foundation that really changes the way people view the world around them too, good or bad. Alright, so the Academic School of the Writers associated with the magazine D. Reservoir, founded in 1973, which preferred to elegantly crafted analytical fictions to mere storytelling. So fictional miniaturism continued to thrive by the way of short stories. And examples of prominent people who were doing this is Anton Kuhans, Simon Kamgit, and F.B. Holtz. So, also to emphasize too, and I'll end on this, from the 1930s, Dutch literature and Flemish literature has been a part of a composite literature culture. and the Writers' Literature Organization and Departments of Culture of the two countries have worked very close in cooperation. All right, so I'm gonna wrap up and give a little bit of commentary to end here by saying these things here. So, as I mentioned, the 20th century here gave a lot of an initiation to the understanding of how valuable monumental change can be to society. But also in those strives of great triumph, there was a lot of just devastating tragedies that was going on. In particular, when we get in the midst of how war really brought that all out here. And and then the aspects of the brutality of understanding that you can't really have that sense of reality of a situation. All was not happening at my own doorstep. And those things were driven home when you think about Anne Frank and the situation that she was going through. And then there's when I was growing up, and it was really something, and it's really telling into the aspects of how different school systems are today versus now versus then. But my children are they're very fortunate to be in a very great, wonderful school system here. But anyhow, so when I was at fourth grade, there was this book, and it had to do with a girl who was Dutch, and it went, and it was written so well. I wish I can remember the title of it. I just remember the story, and I remember what the little girl, the image that was on the book about the little girl. And so it was from the point of view of a little girl, but on the other hand, it was talking about the aspects of experiencing something so harsh like that, with the aspects of World War II and the Nazi invasion, and trying to go on. And another really good example of this is that movie should have won a Oscar, and no wonder. And let me rephrase it. It's so great that movie did win an Oscar, because it was really I get speechless when I think about it, because it is so very poignant to the point that I want to end on. So, life is beautiful, right? And the man who was the Oscar winner and everything, he really deserved that, because the kind of character that he portrayed, oh my goodness, that was something that hadn't been done in a long time. And I don't know if something like that will ever be done again, but it would be very sweet if it is, and if it is done again, it should be respected. So the whole thing is, him and his young son are unfortunately going through the aspects of being in camps, if I'm not mistaken, right? Let me look it up before I say something. Hold on. All right, so what he did was, he was trying to shield his son, and I'm right what I'm talking about the Nazi concentration camps, of what was going on in their town and them being taken and everything. And what he did was he made it seem like it was all a game. And he did this very fanatical thing and playmaking and everything to make sure that his son never understood what was actually going on. And so that is remiss into the aspects of understanding how, when you have that kind of mindset and you take that on in through history, literature, and culture, that can really help shape the betterment for the next generation and the betterment for understanding how we should all have this mentality that we're all in this together for the most part. Really understanding that we're all in this together for the most part, right? And see, and I use that as lip service, right? And really drive home into the aspects of understanding that it's far better to be proactive and do something about grave injustices, things that are actually grave injustices to our society, so we don't get so far left field to where there's no turning back. And also to have, as I reiterated, the aspects, it's not on my doorstep. And that was, unfortunately, a lot of mentality that was going on. And unfortunate, some people were forced into, by death or so forth, into believing that, right? But on the other hand, the ones that say, no, enough's enough. There's something to be said about that, too. And then the aspects of this being presented in Dutch literature and the aspects of this artistic movements and all of these things, that's really brings us from not seeing as far worlds apart, but closer together. Just a humble opinion there. Word for thoughts. All right, so with that said, this reaches the end of the Harboring Light. Tune in, turn up, and definitely take care. Bye-bye for now.